Very good morning to one and all present here. It gives me immense pleasure to extend to you a very warm welcome on behalf of MSSRF, who has clubbed all of us for the Millennium Lecture on building resilience in the face of coming natural and socio-economic shocks, delivered by one of the eminent scientists and world-renowned librarian, Dr. Ismail Serageldin, and a discussion chaired by Professor MS Swaminathan, founder of MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. Now it's time for invocation song. The song Kurai Ondrum Illai Kanna, meaning grievances, no grievances have I. This song was sung by the famous singer Bharata Ratna MS Subbulakshmi, and it is one of the few songs written by Indian politician, freedom fighter and Governor General of India, C. Gopalachari. The song was sung by MS Subbulakshmi herself in the inauguration function of a foundation in 1992. Please remain seated during the song. Thank you.
மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா குறையொன்றுமில்லை கண்ணா குறையொன்றும் இல்லை கோவிந்தா கண்ணுக்கு தெரியாமல் நிற்கின்றாய் கண்ணா கண்ணுக்கு தெரியாமல் நின்றாலும் எனக்கு குறையொன்றுமில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா வேண்டியதை தந்திட வெங்கடேசன் நின்றிருக்க வேண்டியது வேறில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா மணிவண்ணா மலையப்பா கோவிந்தா 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 திரையில் பிள்ளைக்கின்றாய் கண்ணா கண்ணா திரையில் பிள்ளைக்கின்றாய் கண்ணா உன்னை மறையோதும் ஞானியர் மட்டுமே காண்பார் திரையில் பிள்ளைக்கின்றாய் கண்ணா உன்னை மறையோதும் ஞானியர் மட்டுமே காண்பார் என்றாலும் குறையொன்றும் எனக்கில்லை கண்ணா என்றாலும் குறையொன்றும் எனக்கில்லை கண்ணா உந்தின் மேல் கல்லாகி நிற்கின்ற வரதா உந்தின் மேல் கல்லாகி நிற்கின்ற வரதா குறையொன்றும் இல்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா குறையொன்றும் இல்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா மணிவண்ணா மலையப்பா கோவிந்தா 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 கலிநாளுக்கு இறங்கி கலிலே இறங்கி நிலையாக கோயிலில் நிற்கின்றாய் கேசவா கலிநாளுக்கு இறங்கி கல்லிலே இறங்கி நிலையாக கோயிலில் நிற்கின்றாய் கேசவா குறையொன்றும் இல்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா யாதும் மறைக்காத மலையப்பா யாரும் மறுக்காத மலையப்பாவும் மார்பில் ஏதும் தரல் நிற்கும் கருணை கடலன்னை என்றும் இருந்திட எது குறை எனக்கே என்றும் இருந்திட எது குறை எனக்கே ஒன்றும் குறையில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா ஒன்றும் குறையில்லை மறைமூர்த்தி கண்ணா மணிவண்ணா மலையப்பா கோவிந்தா 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 கோவிந்தா
Now I invite Dr. V. Selvam, the lead Coastal System Research and Climate Change, to deliver the welcome address.
Respected Professor, esteemed Chief Guest Dr. Ismail Serageldin, distinguished participants, colleagues and friends. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this important Millennium Lecture on building resilience in the face of coming natural and socio-economic shocks. I don't know what kind of shocks he is going to describe, but I feel that one of the shocks that we may face in the future is climate-related impacts. And the climate-related impacts is no longer a theoretical projections. It's a reality. For example, if you see that the hard data collected from the tidal cages from 178 ports located across the globe indicates the sea level has already increased by about 12 centimeter at the rate of about in the last 3-4 decades. So every year it increases by about 4 centimeters. It's a reality. It's not just a simulation model. It's not just a theoretical projection. And the impact of such increase in the sea level, we know very well that how it affects the coastal livelihood and the socio-economic conditions of the coastal communities. Apart from this, the hard data also indicates the sea surface temperature has already increased by about 1 degree Celsius. It's also interacting with the atmospheric wind and other temperature, and it creates more and more intense cyclone. One of the best example is the recent Gaja cyclones, which made landfall in the Nagapattan regions. So these kind of things we are going to face. These kind of the shocks from the Gaja cyclone. Still, the people are feeling it. Even after 3 months, they could not recover from the shock itself. I don't know how long it will take for them to get rehabilitated. But so these kind of things that we are one big shock that I feel that it is more related to the climate change. And in this context, the present lecture will be very important. And I am also very happy to see we not only for example, this Professor Swaminathan has predicted in 1986 itself that this should happen, and he advocated that we have to preserve the coastal biospheres like mangroves, and also we have to focus our efforts to develop crop varieties that can be used to grow in the saline affected areas. So this is actually one of the thrust areas of the foundation: conservation of the mangroves as well as developing saline tolerant crops. So in this context, I feel that we will be getting more inputs from this lecture also. And I am very happy to introduce Dr. Ismail Serageldin. He served as the Vice President of the World Bank for nearly 8 years, and also he served as the Chairman of the International the Consultative Group on International Agriculture Research. He was the founder and Chairman of the Global Water Partnership, which made a lot of impacts in the management of water resources, and a distinguished professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Above all, he is the founding director of the world famous Bibliotheca Alexandria, the new library of Alexandria in Egypt. With these few words, I once again welcome you all to this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would like to request Dr. Bhavani, the Director, Agriculture, Nutrition and Health at MSSRF, to felicitate our chief guest with a shawl. Thank you, madam. Now I request our chief guest, Dr. Ismail Serageldin, to deliver his Millennium speech.
Dr. Swaminathan, my friend, my inspiration, it's great to be here with you again to meet Dr. Nitya here and to meet all of your colleagues here, and to say to all the colleagues here how privileged you all are to work with the one and only Dr. Swaminathan. I was asked to speak about resilience, and specifically about the fact that resilience really is about people. At the end of the day, it is about what we do for our societies, and as such, it involves not just the engineering and the activities, but also the institutional arrangements and the like. So that's why I started by putting a lot of people holding hands, because strong communities are the basis for better resilience in our societies faced with what we're going to have to face. And given the general theme of what we're dealing with, I'm going to start with climate change and a few words on vulnerability by the impacts of climate change, extreme poverty and hunger, and then slow onset disasters, of which the most famous one, which just mentioned, was sea level rise, and conflicts in many parts of the world, including Africa and the Middle East right now, more so than in other places. Conflicts are destroying everything in sight. Those of you who had been to Icarda or seen what it was like in Syria before the current disasters, well, that also requires resilience of the communities, both as refugees in other parts of the world and as those who will rebuild once that is possible to do. Then definitions of resilience, and there's something called the Sendai framework, which is, I'm surprised at how few people know about it, but essentially in 2015, which was the peak of public awareness among the leaders of the world, we had 3 agreements: the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the Paris Accords, and the Sendai agreements, which are agreements to lower and minimize disaster risk. And then this really is about the, the issue in the end is that to design properly activities for resilience, we need a lot of science. And that involves both the social sciences as well as the natural sciences. And unfortunately, that work is not done adequately, but that's what would lead towards better policies and programs to promote that. So with that, every time you see a red slide like that, you'll know that I'm starting a new chapter of these chapters and getting closer to the end, so, so you'll be able to withstand. So, okay, Mr. Trump doesn't seem to know the difference between weather and climate. He's been tweeting about the cold in the United States and saying, where's the climate change and where's the global warming? So we can tell him, indeed, that it is a result of global warming that this is happening. You know all of that, so I'm going to skip it. But the fundamental point is that both extremes in terms of weather and floods in rain, as well as droughts and desertification, are going hand in hand, and that what we are most going to face is a variation of extreme events, and that these include hurricanes, droughts, heat, and forest fires, and more extreme weather events generally. To those who doubt, I have a very nice diagram that I can show you. This is the mapping of the pathways of high-level hurricanes, and this is, you can see here, that's Florida of the United States, and that's the Gulf, and that's the United States. 10 years later, that's the number of tracks. 10 years later, that's the number of tracks. I think, I mean, we don't need numbers. It's visually so powerful that we can't argue. Meantime, while the hurricanes are pummeling the east coast of the United States, on the west coast of the United States, we had droughts and forest fires, which could be predicted to continue all year based on a federal report that appeared in November 2018. And plus sea level rise, storm surges, which are different from earthquakes, volcanoes, and tsunamis. And this shows that, generally speaking, we will have increases in the sea level rise, but we also expect that we will have storm surges. Now, storm surge is different in that it's driven by wind and rain, usually with a storm, on the surface of the water. And it can cause a lot of damage. And more importantly, there are such complexities in the weather system and the analytics of the weather system that we don't know exactly what could happen and when and how fast. So, for example, we know that the deep currents in the oceans are impacting on all our weather, but at the same time, we know that the warm weather, which is this red line here, kind of protects Europe. And then it sinks down when it comes near Greenland, and then goes down again deep. These are the two major points where the warm water becomes cold and goes down. If Greenland, which is here, which is the second largest glacier mass compared to Antarctica, were to melt, then in fact this water would get colder, and the warm water could start going down lower, maybe here. If that happens, then in fact Northern Europe would be exposed to an ice age, which in the midst of all we're talking about global warming is kind of surprising, but it's not the only reason it's there. So these are the same points I was showing you before, and that in fact this protection that Europe receives may disappear if Greenland disappears. So we have the ice melt in Greenland is causing a lot of concern because it's accelerating very fast, twice as fast as was expected. And the paper in Nature in November of 2018 about this, which is very dramatic. And when and how that will happen, of course, we need a lot more analysis to know that. Now, so serious are these new figures that some are reviving the possibilities of various geoengineering schemes to combat climate change. When I was the first vice president at the World Bank dealing with environment, I was one of the people who set aside the geoengineering solutions, meaning geoengineering at the global level, like putting reflective aerosols up in the atmosphere. The problem being, of course, that you can't withdraw them after you put them up. That's very difficult. And we need to be reminded about the CFCs and the ozone layer. Who thought that CFCs that were propellants and refrigerants would actually knock a hole in the ozone layer and expose humanity to more ultraviolet radiation and potential cancer? So luckily we were able to have the Montreal Protocol that plugged up that, but it just shows that in trying to cope with one aspect, unexpected byproducts elsewhere are very serious, and the science needs to be extremely clear. Now, the science could not explain how the CFCs did that until Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland explained how these molecules actually did like a chain reaction once they got into the ozone layer, and they got the Nobel Prizes for chemistry for that. But anyway, that's a topic for another lecture, what happens with geoengineering and so on. We are where we are right now, and we are vulnerable. So let's talk about climate change as we know it right now and what's happening and where we are. And the devastation of extreme weather events is enormous. Here you can see a part of the American coast, and that's right after the hurricane, and you can see the conditions that are left behind. The devastation is becoming more and more acute, and in Africa, erratic rainfall and desertification is going to impact almost all of Africa, and in fact at a time when the population of Africa is expected to not only more than double or treble, even quadruple by the end of the century. From 1.1 billion people to 4.4 billion people, that is the expected UN consensus report. And they would have to live off already the shortages of production here and there, but to quadruple or to even treble the population, you would have to cope with the same amount of land, but with much better management of water. Because the drying of the land, of course, alternating with the floods, is serious because 95% of the agriculture in Africa is rain-fed, it is not irrigated. And the pastoralists already live very precarious existences, and therefore when the rainfall varies greatly, you get more desertification, and the distribution of groundwater is not adequate to help people cope with that change. In fact, we have been pumping the groundwater to a level where in the last 30 years before the last wars started in Syria, the Syrian water table, which ICARDA used to measure, has gone down by a meter a year for 30 years. So it shows you what's going on. And then in Africa, this is in the Sahel in Niger, where the well, they have to go down, deeper and deeper, and then maybe find a few drops of water, and then you get desertification of the area around it. As to the Arab world, well, the Arab world, which is North Africa and the Middle East, you have a serious problem of heat and dust and water scarcity. The problem is huge. Now, simply stated, this is the largest desert area in the world, as you can see. And the problems we have are acute. We have 5% of the population of the world, 1% of the water. That's our starting point. And we expect, as we said, with more extreme events, that tenfold what? Number of extreme hot days, more than 50 degrees, reaching 50 degrees. So from 16 days on average, we'll reach 120 or more. And on top of that, of course, we expect 99% of the landmass will be affected by increase, and it will be affected both in the cities, which are very dense and it almost will become unlivable, and the slow sea level rise, because the whole coast of the Mediterranean is very low, and as a result, we will be affected. In fact, the three most at-risk deltas, and that will be where I will be ending my talk about deltas, is the Nile, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Mekong. And then these are the three extreme ones in the whole world, and then high near the Mississippi. But there you have everything from saltwater intrusion to actual flooding because of the sea level rise to actual storm surges, which are different. So 5% of the population, 1% of the water, and we are going to have a lot more of the problem. In fact, in terms of per capita, there is less than 500 cubic meter per year, says the United Nations, and already 12 of these countries are water stressed. And the poor suffer the most. And that is why our design must be pro-poor, pro-women, and pro-environment. So what are the negative impacts? Well, simply stated, a dry region will become drier, a hot region will become hotter, a food importing region will need to import even more food, the Mediterranean coast will be subject to storm surges, sea level rise will impact the delta, the Nile Delta, and governments are not taking any action to prepare for that future. How serious is it? Well, let me give you some examples. This is what a sandstorm looks like. And sandstorms there are extremely difficult, extremely difficult. So this is visibility in the, or maybe better this one. This is Dubai in a sandstorm, and you can barely see the world's biggest building. The world's biggest building is barely visible over here. This is the Burj Khalifa that you can see. Now, we're expected to get where we get maybe 4 or 5 days a year where sandstorms occur. We're expecting to get 150. So if you add 120 days with more than 50-degree heat, 150 days of sandstorms like that, we're no longer talking about sustainability, we are talking about habitability. I mean, would people be able to live in a place which is like that? So people will tell you the desert climate, well, the sandstorms and the occasional rain will produce flash floods. And that's another example of that. And this is what you need when you are confronting a sandstorm. You need goggles and breathing water and something to cover yourself, a nice shawl to cover yourself. on other parts of the world, like here in India, for example, we would be concerned about the Hindu Kush Himalayan zone, which is about 2,000 miles stretching right across, as you can see here, covering parts of South Asia, all of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, and Pakistan. And it's from these melts that 1 billion people depend on much of that to supplement the waters on which food security is produced. But it's extremely difficult to predict what is going to happen to these ice melts because of the microclimates and the microgeographies, which have ups and downs and impact on the water flows, and makes it very difficult. So the National Academy of Sciences of the United States had a report a couple of years ago, and it said it remains unclear what specific manifestations of climate change will be in specific places. And that's why friends of mine and myself started something called RAC, Regional Action for Climate Change, which is global models are too coarse. We need regional or local models to guide local action. We really need to come down to a much bigger scale. And luckily, the new technologies and new data make it available. But we do expect anywhere that we'll have irregular rainfall, alternating droughts and floods, and more extreme weather events. Now, this adds to the vulnerability of extreme poverty and the hungry. And what is the definition of extreme poverty? I would like to go back to 1973 when my late friend Robert McNamara, who was president of the World Bank, he defined absolute poverty as a condition of deprivation that falls below any rational definition of human decency. And I think that is true. It started out with $1 a day, as they were saying in those days, and then but that is, I think, the fact that it is below any definition of human decency and therefore requires action to abolish it. Not alleviate it, not facilitate it, abolish it. Nothing less than that will do. Now, we say we were very pleased with ourselves to announce that we reduced poverty in half in the MDGs before, well, that's not quite true. There's a little bit of cheating goes on there. In the same way as with climate change, when we talk about carbon levels, we are going back to 1990. So it wasn't exactly from 2000 to 2015. It was from 1990 to 2015 that reduction took place. And it's good that it took place, but we need to do a lot more. And now we are committed to ending extreme poverty, as we call it, in a definition of the Sustainable Development Goals between 2015 and 2030. So this is celebration that we cut in half and so on, but not quite true. Now, the World Bank estimated 1.44 billion people live in extreme poverty, subsisting on an average of $1.25, which is the figure for 2000. And then it goes on that it has by this definition, the multidimensional poverty index estimates that 1.6 billion people are living in extreme poverty. What does that mean? It means that it is a simplification to simply say we are going to count the number of people who are below an average poverty line. Example, when I was a graduate student at Harvard writing my PhD thesis, I was broke. I very frequently didn't have any money. But I was not poor. I was not marginalized. On the contrary, I was an elite of the elite to be doing my PhD at Harvard. I had social access. I had expectations, etc., etc. So poverty has many dimensions that are not captured by a single poverty line, and that causes a problem. Even then, we have had today, we say it's $1.90 here in 2011 prices, which is equivalent to $2.12 in 2018. And this is equivalent to the $1 a day in 96 prices. So people are tinkering a lot of the time, worrying about, is it $1.90, $2.12, $1.98, etc. And I think that this is missing the point, because we need to go back again to discuss who these people are in that condition that is beneath any definition of decency. Actually, India used to be the country that had the largest number. As of May 2018, Nigeria now has more, 87 million versus 83 million there. And by the MDGs, you know, reducing the extreme poverty was met 2015, so we're going to go forward. But these are nice pictures. And I was fighting with my friends at the World Bank and the UN, telling them, why are you putting nice pictures of children? Look at how clean the kids are and so on. You should show the reality. And they said, what? I said, okay, I'll show you the reality. People who have nothing to eat, people who are below any definition of human decency, whether you're looking at what they're bearing or what they're trying to do, how they live, the dogs and themselves living off the garbage, sleeping in the streets. This is a condition beneath any definition of human decency. So the nice looking kids with big smiles that they put on the publications of the UN are really a misnomer. And this is closer to the reality. I was recently discussing with the Vice President for Africa at the World Bank, and he says on average between 1 and 3 countries have a failure of crops once a year. And he was discussing with them that you can't, they said we want an emergency loan, and he says fine, I'm happy to give you an emergency loan, but my business is to help development, not to step in here for failure, crop failure here, crop failure there. No, we need to have a system, and that's where resilience will come in. Now, there are many studies. That's not the question. But in the end, this is the statement that counts, is that what we're talking about is a condition beneath any definition of human decency, and it must be abolished. Now, to understand extreme poverty and hunger and design effective programs to combat them, we need to be able to measure and analyze the complex, multifaceted reality of the phenomenon, not just use the head count index of a number of people below a poverty line. So if you measure poverty, the 3 most famous poverty measures are the head count index, which is what everybody is now using, or the depth of poverty, the poverty gap, advanced by my good friend, the great Indian economist Amartya Sen, and the Foster-Greer-Thorbecke index, with which Sen also collaborated. Simply stated, so if you have the head count index, you can also compare groups. Like in the United States, you can say the percentage of households below the poverty line for American Indian or Black or Hispanic or so on. You can compare these groups in that fashion. But there is also a question that Amartya Sen was raising, is how far below the artificially decided poverty line are the actual people? Are they very close to the line, about step above it, or are they way deep below? Do we know that? So we need a different measure, and that's the measure of the depth of poverty or the poverty gap. And then our friend Jim Foster was able to add this alpha that you see over here. We refer to it as the FGT poverty index, or the P alpha coefficient, and it's very convenient because depending on how you set it, if you set alpha equal to 0, you get the head count index. If you set it equal to 1, you get the poverty gap. And if you set it equal to 2, you get something. I mean, if you want the actual mathematical termination, it's the mean of squared proportionate poverty gaps, which is not very useful. But I think if you simply think of it as the amount of poverty, the depth of poverty, and the severity of poverty, which is usually associated with hunger, where you find a higher P alpha, where the alpha is equal to 2, it is usually associated with a widespread hunger and malnutrition. So these indices should be supplemented by something else, which is inequality in society. And inequality is a separate and completely different method, but most people feel that the world has become incredibly unequal and unfair. And the notion, again, of building resilience will include how communities link together, how countries link together, to cope with something like that. And the presence of extreme inequality usually leads, in fact, to the opposite of solidarity. There's an enormous gap that exists between the rich and the poor. And this is a very telling graph, which this is America, actually. But this 1980, this is like 35 years here, and even before that. This is Reagan and Thatcher come to power. And then they tell everybody, private sector will do everything, governs best that governs least, get out of the way of the private sector and let them run things. All this notion of a welfare state, they refer to the nanny state and so on. And what do you have? Well, actually, you had the bottom 50% of America used to get about 20% of the total income, and the top 1% used to get about 10%. Over these 35 years, the top 1% now receives 20+%, and the bottom 50% has gone down from 20 to 12. Now, many of these people, although they don't have the statistics and the analysis, have become Trump voters. Why? Well, one of the interesting things is that you really cannot tell a difference about whether it was Democrats or Republicans who were in power. I mean, it's one long decline over 35 years. And that's why, for the first time, when people asked them, what do you think about your children, for the first time, Americans said, I don't think my children will live better than I do. In fact, I think they will live worse, which was a major change from the traditional view of the American dream. Again, issues of solidarity, there is no solidarity. America is one of the most divided societies that you run across today. So you have very rich people and you have very poor people. Some people don't know how to spend their money. Some people don't know where they'll get their food from. And this is a particularly stunning picture from Brazil, actually. This is the slum over here, on this side of the wall. And on this side of the wall, private swimming pools on each balcony. Cheek by jowl, incredibly rich people with incredibly poor people next to them. And so what do we have to deal with that side of the equation? We have the Gini coefficients and the Lorenz curve. And that goes back to Max Otto Lorenz, who in 1905 developed the Lorenz curve to describe income inequalities, which was then taken up by Corrado Gini in 1912 to design the Gini coefficient. And these remain to this day the cornerstone of dealing with inequality and understanding inequality. And Amartya Sen said, look, what we're doing basically is to look at all of society, not just the 2 or 3 people who are below the poverty line, but look at the distribution around the poverty line and use that in pairwise comparisons. That's the equation, but skip the equation, and we have a very nice explanation. The Gini coefficient is a fraction, and it is useful because you can look at a trend over time. And this is America, and this was the war on poverty that occurred with Lyndon Johnson at the time of the Vietnam War. And then this is, you can see the trend. It's, now this is in the Lorenz curve. The Lorenz curve basically says that if you put the distribution of households on one side, distribution of households and the distribution of income, then you have the perfect equality is one line, the 45-degree angle line. And if all of the money is held by one person, then you would have, of course, 0. If everybody gets an equal share, you'd have this blue line. But the reality is usually something along the red line. And therefore, in fact, this becomes more and more unequal, as you can see here. So the difference between the Lorenz curve and the curve of perfect equality is what yields the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient enables you, that's becoming more unequal. As it goes down, as the green space becomes bigger, it becomes more unequal. So if you look at this, thoughtful multiple use is needed. This is what various Gini coefficients look like for different countries. You can compare them, and you can look at a trend. This was the curve for the United States. And you can also compare different countries over periods of time. So that's kind of an added dimension. So it's not just the absolute number of people below some line. It is also how the society deals with itself for equality that's important to understand that. So we need a thoughtful use of multiple indicators that will lead to a richer and more nuanced policy program for what we do, including, for example, this work by IFAD, which was called the MPAT, or the multiple indicator of poverty, and among other things, number 9, which is here, is resilience. So we're beginning to recognize that one of the qualities that is important is not just where people are either in the income distribution or in the inequality curve. It is how able are they, given their control of resources, their solidarity with each other, their access to mechanisms of transformation, to cope with shocks that will come their way. And so we need more of that. Now, we need data. That's what all scientists would tell you. We need more data. But to me, what's very important is that data, when organized, becomes information. And information, when explained, becomes knowledge. But we need more than knowledge. We need wisdom. We need to translate that knowledge into action. To use an extreme case, the United States just passed a tax bill that was worth $1.5 trillion over 10 years of a giveaway to rich people. They reduced the corporate tax from 38% to 22%. Now, they had knowledge, they had data, but I don't think that they had much wisdom. So anyway, that's another thing which we need to do. Now, quickly on slow onset disasters, we know about how the climate change is there. What I think is very dangerous is that we have made some advances even on the measure of number of people below a poverty line. But I fear that some of these impacts from climate change are going to push back some people below the poverty line. So where we were advancing, we will now sort of go back. Among these things is something that I've been very associated with for many years. When back in 1995, as vice president of the bank, I said, the wars of this century have been on oil, and the wars of the next century will be on water. And that, unfortunately, is becoming very real in many parts of the world, where water shortages are affecting both droughts and crop failures, cattle death, desertification, loss of groundwater. And these water shortages, and combined with floods that go by, are resulting in a lot of misery for a lot of people. But more fundamentally, the question is, can we then restore the condition of the groundwater? Can we restore the conditions with better water harvesting? Can we improve the quality of our work with plants so that we can deal with it? What about rainfall? Well, rainfall is going to be very problematic. Again, looking at Africa, whose population is going to treble, let's say at least, you have up there the desert condition, the extreme Sahara conditions, that in red. In orange, you have the hot semi-arid. And in blue, the tropical climate of the Central and Western Africa. And Southern Africa has a mix of things, which is, you can see here in green, and a little bit in Ethiopia as well. But fundamentally, it's the blue part will have lots of rain in certain moments, droughts in others. Most of the others will have a reduction in the available rainfall otherwise. So the major constraints will remain land and water. The land will be subjected to the desertification, and the gains of the desert are really the march of drought and death. Anubis is the god of death to the ancient Egyptians. So to use a statement from our good friend David Zeckler from the CGIAR, we need more crop per drop. That is true for water. And the sea level rise, of course, will affect the deltas, not just by swamping everything. Even small rises will result in saltwater intrusion into the available aquifers, and that will be quite serious. So at a half meter rise, we expect about 4 million people to be displaced and to lose about 1,800 square kilometers of cropland. If it reaches a meter, we're talking about over 6 million population and almost 5,000 square kilometers of cropland. And a few natural scientists have been concerned with these issues, but Egyptian society, media, government, social sciences are not sufficiently engaged in addressing this, and we need social studies to get involved, the social scientists, not just the natural scientists. So additional problems is a storm surge. So what's a storm surge? Well, surprisingly, I learned that a storm surge becomes more powerful if the slope is very gentle, not the opposite. A steep slope does not create a strong storm surge, but storm surges can be very serious. A huge wave that hits shores during storms, primarily caused by extremely high winds, and it is not a tidal wave or a tsunami. So this is how it's done from the surface. So I was on a committee of experts that was asked to look at the city of Venice. And as we know, Venice has been sinking underwater already. So the question was, they're building a huge doorways to control the lagoon, and they wanted to know what would be likely to be a storm surge. Well, storm surge comes with big storms, usually where wind is more than 100 kilometers and where there's rain, and the shallow coastal shelf will create a bigger surge. But what you need, and this is very subtle, is you need the wind to be going exactly down the middle of the Adriatic. If it's slightly inclined, it will hit here and it will not build up a lot. It will hit here or here. So to hit Venice, which is way down there, you have to have the storm running exactly down the middle of the Adriatic and for a sustained period. And we showed, incidentally, that this was likely to be once every 30 years. Now, on the developing country side of the Mediterranean, everything is exposed. These are the prevailing winds, and as you can see, all the coastline doesn't have, I mean, instead of having to find a way of going just exactly right in the opposite direction down the middle of the Adriatic, no, it's wide open, and therefore all this coastline, with the cities that are there from Alexandria to Tunis to Algiers, etc., are going to be subjected to frequent storm surges. How frequent? Well, 4 or 5 years ago, we had one of those in Alexandria, and it lifted an entire boat, big ship, lifted it off and put it on land. It's not just a matter of people walking down the shore and getting drenched with water. No, this is serious stuff. The sea level rise, well, the extreme scenarios are worth thinking about. If all of Greenland glaciers melt, sea levels would rise 6 meters. If Antarctica melt, 60 meters. Now, 60 meters, there was a movie, I think, with Kevin Costner called Waterworld, where the whole world had disappeared under the expansion of the seas. That would be something like that. Now, can we protect our coastlines and our cities on the coasts? The Netherlands, of course, has many great projects, including this one. Netherlands, 1/3 of the country is below sea level, so they've done this for many, many years. So talk about resilience, about preparation, about communities understanding what they have to do, about the infrastructure being there to do it. And other countries have undertaken defenses, including the Thames. There was a big surge back in 1955, and they created these barriers for it. But I think more important than the barriers is the fact that they also captured the imagination of the public and said to them, look, do you really want London to look like that? Although right now the Houses of Parliament, considering what the votes were on Brexit and how they're debating with each other, they might as well be underwater. They don't seem to be able to do much about that. But in addition, there are impacts on energy. So these are hurricanes in Miami. This is Venice now. This is a formulation of what could happen in New York. This is San Francisco, left and right. You can see as is and as could happen with sea level rise. But we need action on both mitigation and adaptation. And action must be based on sound scientific studies. And I would say while all of these are inextricably interlinked, they have focused mostly on energy and climate. I would personally like to focus more on poverty and equity as well as food and water. Because the key to human well-being will be water and food security, and the systematic approach of how to handle that is needed. This is the latest NOAA global mean sea level scenarios, and this is where you can see how many meters we're talking about now, and it is much more than it used to be. And we are monitoring specifically, this is Greenland, where the sea ice is melting rapidly, and these are the top 10 high water events at Lower Manhattan. But fundamentally, the sea ice is now melting twice as fast. The paper in Nature in November, last November, twice as fast as we expected it to be. Now, one last point on vulnerability is conflicts. And the current conflicts, of course, destroy livelihoods and induce outmigration. And it's pervasive. This is Africa and Asia, and there's only one of these conflicts which comes from Latin America. Everything else is in Africa and Asia. And the destruction is absolute. So civil wars everywhere, and you can see the tanks and the refugees going in different directions. And regretfully, the world is no longer welcoming refugees almost anywhere. This is the UN figure, 65.6 million forcibly displaced people, almost 70 million people forcibly displaced with nowhere to go. And where once upon a time, the Statue of Liberty stood saying, "Give me your poor, your huddled masses." That is no longer the case. They are being rejected everywhere. And the destruction of these civil wars is absolute. Even they continue to fight among the ruins. This part is, we don't have good pictures of it, but that's in Somalia and Kenya. And millions of refugees. Syria, millions of refugees, even in small countries. When small countries like Lebanon and Jordan can each take 2 million refugees, and then Europe, which has 501 million people, cannot take 1 million refugees. United States, 330 million people, 50,000 refugees only. It is, we've lost something. These are entering a Jordanian camp from Syria. And no wonder desperate people try to go to Europe, and in fact, many of them die. So the future, well, more climate change, more poverty, more outmigration. So what can we do about increasing resilience? Well, there, I think it's important to talk about resilience as a personal human quality, as a community quality, as a regional quality where people can get together and the government can play a national quality, but also a systems quality. We can talk about the resilience of an ecosystem. We can talk about the resilience of the banking system to shocks and so on and so forth. So there's a systems quality as well. So it's as much a process as an outcome. The system will be affected, any system will be affected by an external block, but then it can mount again, and maybe we can rebuild better than we were before. It's a process as well as an outcome. It's, there's adversity, there's mediation, and there's better than expected outcomes. That's what we want. It involves learning and knowledge, participation, institutional capacities, and integration. It is, as somebody said, the courage to come back after having been hit very badly. So it addresses entire systems that are likely to be devastated by force majeure, and the problems being confronted will require solidarity in addition to construction and infrastructure, and all institutions in the nation across sectors plus international assistance. And the Sendai framework, which was the third major agreement signed at the same time as the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Accords, in fact, talks about preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk through the implementation of integrated and inclusive economic, structural, legal, social, health, cultural, educational, environmental, technological, political, and institutional measures. So it's really bringing all of the resources of a nation together, and to do so will enable us to have less negative impacts. It is a focus on people-centered, preventative approaches to disaster risk reduction. You need to educate the people about the risks that are coming so they're not mistaken by it. They're willing to invest in preparing to cope with it, and all of society must be ready to help each other where it occurs. An extreme case which you all know about is the Fukushima disaster. I mean, I couldn't believe how orderly the Japanese were after having been hit by an earthquake, by the meltdown of a nuclear reactor, and by a tsunami, how orderly they were in evacuating the place where it happened, how the rest of the country coped with the problem, and that is what we need. So the role of science and academia, we really need to focus on disaster risk factors and scenarios, including the newly emergent disaster risks, including such things as the potential in the midst of all of these disasters that you suddenly have pandemics, epidemics, diseases that will happen, the polluted water, etc. So many things that can happen. So the Sendai framework talks about one global outcome, one goal, 7 global targets, 13 guiding principles, 4 levels, and the role for stakeholders. And we need to reduce mortality, affected people, economic loss, but increase countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. Unfortunately, there aren't enough countries that have prepared for the idea, where decision makers are even willing to consider that there is a potential for disaster, and therefore, you can do a lot if you anticipate the disaster and you start thinking about it from the beginning, in priorities and in engaging the whole nation in doing it, but above all, with state and local institutions and governments, and to involve the people in doing that. Now, you require executive leaders, you require command staff, incident managers, and general personnel. In America, they refer to them as first responders, those who come and help for fires or earthquakes or whatever. And the monitoring mechanism has been set up by the Sendai Agreement, and there are key innovations, which is really a strong emphasis on disaster risk as opposed to disaster management after the fact. So the idea being to tell people, I know you haven't had a disaster, but we need you to get started now to prepare for it before it comes. And that's usually the attention span of decision makers. It's very difficult to engage them that way, because they will say, for heaven's sake, I'm trying to cope with existing problems, and you tell me you want me to sit here and anticipate hypothetical problems. Well, the answer is yes, because sooner or later you'll be confronted with it, and the better prepared you are, the less problems you will have. It's primarily the responsibility of states, but both natural and man-made hazards should be considered. So we need to build back better than we did before. We need the risk-sensitive investments, international cooperation, international financial institutions. How does that work in practice? I'll run you through one very quick example. If you look at the delta, because deltas are very vulnerable, as we said, because of sea level rise, because of saltwater intrusion, because of storm surges, because of so many other things. There was a study done in Wageningen University, but the key point is that we had split it into 3 levels. And these 3 levels are, at the bottom, natural resources. In the middle is the network, which is roads, irrigation canals, etc. And at the top is the social and economic activities of people. And these are the drivers of change that we can say here on the left-hand side. Now, this is the mediation that comes by governance. Governance is very important. And we have all these negative drivers. Risk aversion, participation, privatization, decentralization, environmental concerns, and so on. People are very concerned. So what do we need to do? This approach, which was advanced by OECD, says you take your drivers, and then you look at the pressures they cause. There's the state has an impact on it, and there's a response, and then you need to go back and keep looping that until you have acceptable measures that will impact drivers. In theory, that's every question is linked to a host of other issues. So what is expected of us as scientists? Here's what's expected of us as scientists. You start with drivers of change. What are the drivers of change? Well, here they are. But to study each one of those, guess what? There's more things that feed into it. So we need to do all these studies in order to be able to improve our ability to cope with it. That's the research need on these drivers, 5 big groupings, but a lot of additional work to be done. And if you look at that layer model, which has a base networks and occupation layers, the role of the public in protecting the fundamental ecosystem is highest here and least there. The role of private citizens is highest here and least there. So we need to interact with the two. And if you look at the occupation layer, that's in about 10 to 25-year impacts. You start again, as I said, with one thing. You'll find the components that drive it. And then to analyze each of the components, you finally find a hell of a lot more than you did. Same is true of networks such as roads, irrigation canals, etc., etc. And again, you find, and at the base layer, you also have the natural resources in the same way. So it's a very sophisticated set of studies that deal with interactions in a system analysis way. And once we know the path we want to pursue, we must prioritize actions. Why must we prioritize actions? Because things change. So for example, these were the forecasts, best analysis done by IPCC. The actual forecast, this was ice melt at the Arctic, was much faster than even the worst scenarios of IPCC, as you can see here. And this is being repeated right now as we talk about Greenland ice melt and the albedo effect that we're measuring. And you can see here, this is the actual going much faster than the forecasts. So we have to revise our forecasts as we go along. And this is the same one, but slightly different way. And so this changes where is it coming from, etc. What does that mean? It means that you don't have a finished plan forever. You must have a constant monitoring that revises the plan all the time. So the plan for disaster risk reduction and increasing resilience will not happen with just one round of all of this. It has to be maintained systematically as you go along, and that will require overseeing it, not only political leadership, but also public awareness. And so we have a dual task to do that. But we know that, without doing all that work and tying it together with applied systems analysis, we will be facing a disaster. And I say to my friends, consider it an opportunity to revise national strategies. Don't look at it, oh my God, all this extra work. It's a good thing to do, to revise national strategies, because you know, very much like this cartoon, that continuing on the current business is really, this guy is going to fall. I don't know when he's going to fall, but he is going to fall because sowing the limb is going to fall. We need to bring all these policies together into mutual supportive vision. And we're all invited, all of us as human beings, as scientists, as partners, as citizens, to participate in this. And it's very complicated. It looks like the Rubik's Cube. But guess what about the Rubik's Cube? It can be mastered and solved. And in fact, we can solve it for a better future. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for sharing immense knowledge in this most needed period of disasters and climate change. Now the floor is open for questions. I request the participants to keep the questions short and precise.
This is Nambi from WRI, World Resources Institute. I had the privilege of working under you at CGIAR some time back, years back, and when Alexandria wanted us as the executive director. And one of the questions which comes to my mind is, when you talk about resilience and adaptation, a lot of good things have been done at the incremental level. There are wonderful examples in Asia and Africa particularly. It is a time for us to graduate to the transformative. What do you mean by transformation in this context is a very important question to understand. People are struggling, though we know that something has to happen at that scale, that intensity, but still people couldn't figure out what it means. Because resilience is very much a context-driven phenomenon, as you know. So the new normals are going to be there, but then how do we transform to the next level is a big question. How do you do that? And you have some answers to that, but still it's a bit little bit vague, and everybody is grappling with this issue. If you could reflect on that, it would be nice.
Okay, thank you. It's a very good question. Let me just use two examples from the United States. We have witnessed two different sets. On the East Coast, we had hurricanes, a series of hurricanes in the last 12 months or more. And there was enormous variability in the response that was felt. As you may have heard, Puerto Rico stayed without electricity for almost 10 months. Disastrous compared to what happened in Texas, what happened elsewhere. And fundamentally, FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Agency, claimed, and I don't know enough about the facts to be able to argue that, but I did see some of the hearings about this, that it was the weakness of the state institutions in Puerto Rico compared to the state institutions in Texas or in North Carolina that resulted in the inability of the federal assistance to be used, absorbed, and deployed in a way that brought back electricity, brought back things within a number of weeks as opposed to a number of months in the case of Puerto Rico. Another way, look at the other side of the continent. We had these horrible forest fires that went on for months and where entire towns and cities like Paradise were totally wiped out and burned to the ground and so on. In fact, it was quite good what they managed to do, although the disaster was huge. They were able to call and get a number of firefighters from many different states to come and collaborate with those in California, even though they could say, well, I mean, this is your state. Why are you coming to me? No, because they were ready. There was discussion. There were plans already in place with which to do this. So what we have to do is to expect ever larger negative impacts coming along. And that's why I said it's very difficult, because you're talking to decision makers, and they have, my experience has been that the thing in shortest supply is not money. Money is plentiful. It's the attention span of decision makers, because they're being pulled in all directions. And to get them to focus on what might happen, even though as scientists we tell them we expect it will happen. It's not just that it might happen, but it will happen. So it's, we've dealt with hurricanes before, yes, but you haven't dealt with hurricanes at this level of force. We've dealt with forest fires. Not on that scale, you haven't. And you have to be ready and anticipate. What would you do if? And that requires also the education of the public, because public awareness is essential. The actions of NGOs and those who create shelters where people can be put in place, et cetera, is very important. So I think that our task is really to convince not only decision makers, but the public at large, that we must prepare for this. Now, of course, there is that when you have a guy like Trump going around saying it's a hoax, it's not true, the scientists are all wrong, even though 13 federal agencies wrote a report last November for the Congress about the impacts of climate change in the United States, challenging the president, saying, no, it's very serious. But that doesn't help with the public. So you need leadership, political leadership. That's what I was saying at the end. Political leadership and public awareness to constantly redo your plans and expand your programs as you get ready for the inevitable problems that will come sometime in the future.
Thank you for a very educative presentation. I'm Venkatesh Atre, I'm an economist. I have a question that all of us could possibly reflect on, which is that while one could agree with practically everything you said, one also can forgive skeptics in general when they look at the world and find, for example, that, as you pointed out in relation to migration, for example, the quantum of migrants that Europe accepted or that the US accepted was far lower than what the capacities would permit. But this is more general. If you look at the negotiations for a lower carbon economy, for example. Repeatedly, developing countries have sought technological and financial assistance, which has not been forthcoming from the advanced countries. You talk about, educating the community, the public, and also the role of the state. But nowhere is there a discussion of corporate responsibility. I mean, transnational corporations, which are also important drivers of inequality in the advanced countries and elsewhere, and who have been not particularly concerned with climate change, whatever the rhetoric might say on the company, kind of glossies. I think it's important to go beyond general notions of the public and look at the role of different major players in the global scenario, and that includes not just state, but also transnational corporate entities. Every time I see this document, they talk about the role of businesses, but never a discussion of the role of working people, for example. So I think somewhere there, some sense of both international inequality and internal class inequality in various countries. These do play a role, especially in relation to what you're saying about how do you make a community cohesive and work together. If you have huge inequalities, if you have huge differences, that's going to be more difficult to do. And this is happening on a global scale. The Paris Accord, all said and done, isn't quite what humanity needed. It needed something much more than that. Likewise with most other agreements. I have not looked at the Sendai framework, but maybe it's very useful. And Master, you said it's very useful, but I think we have to name the forces that are obstructing a civilized resolution of the challenges that we face.
You're right, and I would regretfully I say that it is the populist politicians who, with their craven links to corporate interests, that are the biggest challenge we have now. Let me start with a general sense. The business of business is business. It's to make money. And in private sector, I can't fault them, because if they don't make money, they go out of business. They go bankrupt. So that's normally what they look for. So when you have a government that comes in, for example, and dismantles all the environmental regulations that had been slowly put in place over years of debates between administrations and Congress, and who open all the federal lands for further oil exploration, who boast about bringing back coal into the United States, even though the people who are in the energy business will tell you that in the US, photovoltaics and wind is much more profitable as an investment than coal mines, then you have a problem. I think we lost, we people who, like us, think globally, try to act locally and think globally. In fact, we lost many of the battles of informing people, and allowed the emergence of populist politicians who feed on hatred. So, the debate right now going on, unfortunately, is not well understood when Nancy Pelosi says the wall is immoral. What does she mean by the wall that Mr. Trump wants to build is immoral? It is immoral in the sense that the people who are coming to the border are not an invasion force. These are incredibly poor people, families that have been driven by some of the worst conditions in Honduras, Salvador, and Nicaragua and Guatemala, and who are coming there and seeking to enter the United States. It is, if you build a wall, it's exactly the opposite of those who built the Statue of Liberty with Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me your poor," and welcomed the dregs of European society when they came, the Irish, the Italians, etc. So when they came, they were being welcomed at the time with the idea that they're going to build a nation, and that this is a different view of the United States, that we want to close down and build a wall from sea to shining sea, instead of doing that. So there's a big debate going on, but the debate, unfortunately, whether you're thinking of the United States, or you're thinking of Brexit, or you're thinking of the emergence in Hungary and elsewhere, is seeing a rise of that point of view. So that point of view is not sympathetic at all to the kinds of things that we were talking about today. The answer, we just have to be more convincing, more involved, better user of media than we have been in the past. The science is the only way to the future. Now, I left a big question mark, but I said it's a topic for another occasion to talk about it. You should think about it. Whether or not, from an economic point of view, the current situation, which is now predicting that we are going to converge on 3 to 5 degrees, not 2 degrees, not 1.5 degrees, that was in Poland last December, whether that justifies at least studying geoengineering solutions with the risks that they have. That's a good question for analysts to think about.
Yep, it's 75 years since the Bretton Woods institutions were created, 1944, and in many ways, I think the World Bank too has been in the core of the last 75 years. If you look at the trajectories, and I think what your presentation showed, and the degradation of environment, ecology, and poverty, and the economic disparity that has progressed, of which these institutions have been very much a part of, I seem to wonder whether we need to look at the fundamental issue of economics, the model of economics, and can we actually, as you just mentioned a few minutes ago, say, the business of business is business. There seems to be a fundamental problem there where we keep this as ceteris paribus, that we will not change the economic model and expect to resolve a lot of our issues around it. Your comments, sir.
Well, actually, I think that my comments are going to be that people have not sufficiently read the classics. I'm a great admirer and defender of Adam Smith. And I've read all he's written, and 2 major works at least, not all he's written, but 2 major works, The Wealth of Nations and the Moral Sentiments. And you have to take them all. Everybody cites 1 sentence out of a 4-volume book on the Wealth of Nations. An invisible hand is going to arrange the competing interests of the private sector that is based on their own interest to serve humanity. That's 1 sentence. Adam Smith recognized a lot of other things as well. He recognized what we now call public goods. Now, he was a genius, because you have to remember, 1776, he writes that the wealth of nations is the work of the farmer, the work of the tradesman, the work of these little guys. It is not the amount of gold and silver that is in the treasury of the king. Very radical, insightful comment. Well, but that was not all. So he does say that, yes, if you have a competitive market, emphasis of the word competitive market, then all these people competing with each other will produce the best available result in terms of the best prices for people who can enter that market and choose on a competitive basis. But then he said, but there are certain things that, while they're extremely valuable, will never be done by the private sector. And he gave the example, this is 1776, of education. He said, I can expect an investor to train workers for his factory, but to educate the whole public so that everybody reads and writes would undoubtedly be beneficial, but I can't expect a private investor to do that. So the state has to do it. So he recognized the idea of public goods. Now we recognize that as well, and we recognize that there is an intervention that is required in other things as well. Then most of all, because this became a very big issue in 2008 when we had the collapse of the banking system, and of course all my friends would write me and I'd say, no, you haven't read Adam Smith. Adam Smith actually wrote a comment on the fact that he was objecting, and he said we need to regulate the banking trade, his words, the banking trade. This is 1776. Is that people who know me and know that I, Adam Smith, stand for private property and freedom would be surprised. If the banker is willing to give a note and my neighbor wants to take the note, why should I interfere? And then he gave a beautiful example. And he said, after the big fire in 1666, London was totally burned down and then was rebuilt. He said, we put restrictions on the rights of private property holders that if you held the property, you had to build a what is today called a firewall between the edge of your property and the other property. And he said, and you may say that this is an intervention in the freedom of the rights of the property holder. But I say, says Adam Smith, that any restrictions on the few for the benefits of the many is the obligation of every government, from the most liberal to the most despotic. Now that's pretty incisive for a guy who was writing 220 years before the 2008 meltdown that we had. And so I think that when you say, do we need to revisit the economic model, there's a lot of work that's been done in economics. I gave the examples of Amartya Sen. I can give you examples of Joe Stiglitz. I can give you examples of many others whose work deserves to be better integrated in what we do. People pick and choose which parts they want to talk about. And they were always stunned when I, as vice president of the World Bank, I would be somewhere and I would say, you know, I want to abolish the word free markets. And vice president of the bank want to abolish the word free markets? I said, yes. We don't want free markets. We want competitive markets. And competitive markets require a system of laws. They require jurisdictions and tribunals. They require a security agency that oversees what people are doing. We criminalize insider trading, etc., etc., etc. So we don't tell me free markets, state, get out of the business, which is what you saw the result of when Reagan and Thatcher told us private sector will do everything. Those who understand good economics will tell you private sector will not do everything and will seek to minimize the costs that they should have or pay. So we have a debate that I think is rich to be engaged in, and we have to be able to convince the public, I think, of our view. Regretfully, last thing I will say is that this populist view tends to be associated with right-wing people, and in particular with anti-science. For example, anti-vaccination, anti-GMO, no evidence. I mean, but people are taking strong positions against science, against presumed elites, and so on. And I think that this is something that we as scientists, whether social scientists or natural scientists, have to join hands in fighting and ensuring that the benefits of the new knowledge and that we can bring forth benefits everybody.
I am Dr. Namalwar, ocean scientist, former principal scientist in the ICR. And it is a very excellent information through your lecture. And about 80% of the natural disasters are closely linked with climate change related, of course. And the recent UN report also says that 4 billion people will be exposed in because of water scarcity countries. And regarding the adaptation mitigation measures and the political willpower, as you said, rightly said, and people's awareness, I think we can overcome this. What is your suggestion? Yes.
I request our professor for a few words.
I'm not able to stand up, so Dr. Ismail Serageldin, I do not know how to thank you for coming. I know you made a special effort to come via Chennai and visit us. The lecture you gave on resilience is also one to which this particular center is committed. In fact, when we started our work in 1990, one of the first research topics was resilience to climate change, both favorable and unfavorable changes in climate. So I think today's lecture, very, very comprehensive, most up-to-date, has been very useful to all our people. Secondly, to my colleagues here, I must say how much humanity owes to you. Remarkable contributions. I know personally he almost restructured the consultative group on international agriculture. A new CGIAR was born when you were president of the CGIAR. Similarly, those of you who have gone to Alexandria and see the library, Bibliotheca Alexandrina, it's a remarkable institution. Most up-to-date, not up-to-date library, but the most thought-provoking futuristic library. Only you can do it. He gave a wonderful job in the World Bank, mainly to come back to his own country, Egypt, and build his wonderful library, Bibliotheca Alexandria. So you have footprints on a number of areas, but I must say today's seminar was very comprehensive. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the talk. But again, I must tell my friends here, the library is one of the finest you can ever see. The 3rd century library has not only revived, but completely changed it. So also the biovision concept, what is the vision for the future? Today's lecture was largely connected with the vision for the future. How to avoid dangers and how to take advantage of opportunities. Now I can go on saying, because I have known him for over 30 years, we have been exceedingly good friends, and this center is also 30 years. Therefore, all the 30 years of our center, we have had the benefit of your advice, your support, and we are grateful to you for I know what effort you have made to come here today. And he came just to wrote to me, I want to see you. I said, come, but will you give a talk? He said immediately, yes. I have got the following 3 topics. You choose one. And the one we chose is very appropriate. Dr. Shelvam will tell you the whole resilience, particularly with reference to in our earlier work, particularly with reference to sea level rise, sea level conditions and so on, and also adaptation, mitigation, and so thank you once again. I'm sure somebody is going to propose what of that. But from a personal point of view, I know how much the world owes you, and I know how much I owe you over a period of time. Thank you. Thank you for your guidance.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all.